What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Perhaps. Happy Good Friday. Today will be the last episode in this series we've been doing through the season of Lent. And then after this, I want to move beyond some of the more explicitly religious stuff and get more broader, talk more about culture and some politics and other stuff that's been going on. But I'm really grateful for everyone who stuck around during this Lent series where we got a little bit deeper, a little bit more Jesus-y. Today, again, will be very, very Jesus-y because today is Good Friday, which is the day that Christians, I want to say celebrate or maybe remember or ritualize or whatever, the day that Jesus was crucified on a cross. And then I'm going to do another episode for this Sunday, just on the Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia, where I'm going to talk about Easter, because I've been doing a monthly Patreon bonus episode of Perhaps on the Patreon now. So go check that out. I'm excited for that. And today we're just going to stick to the crucifixion, or we'll try to at least. But I decided today, there's so many angles we could come at this from, because I'm someone who, I grew up Christian, and then I was in ministry for a while in an evangelical ministry environment. And then I ended up feeling called to be a pastor, which led me to reading and studying more of this stuff so I could be a good, responsible pastor. But that led me to disagreeing with so many of my other evangelical peers at the time, until it led me out of evangelicalism, because I kept finding other ways of interpreting this stuff, and I realized the type of Christian I grew up as was just like a corner of the global historic Christian tradition. And there's so many other ways to talk about this stuff. Actually, I noticed a comment, I think it was a couple podcasts ago. Oh yeah, it was the one on sin. The episode's called "It's Systemic," and there's a comment on the YouTube channel, something like, I was in the middle of leaving a comment, but then I stopped, and now all I'm gonna say is, I hope your side wins, and something like that. But in other words, it seemed like he was implying that he saw I was a Christian and talking about Christian things, and he was getting ready to pop off on me. And then he realized that I'm a different kind of Christian, talking about things from a different perspective than the ones that I'm sure he's really annoyed by. And I get it. I get the irritation. I feel it too. But I'm trying to talk about this stuff from a bigger, deeper perspective, specifically centered around liberation and justice, which includes speaking against the ways that Christians have been responsible for so much injustice through years of colonization and systemic violence against marginalized people. Yeah, that totally makes sense. That guy was ready to pop off. But I say all that to say, because of that, there's so many ways. I mean, I've already talked about the crucifixion on my YouTube channel and articles and stuff before, but I also wrote a whole book called The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus. Came out in 2022. It's usually up there behind me on the wall, but I took it down because we gotta look at this thing. So if you like the way I talk about Jesus, which isn't exactly original to me, I'm not over here just pulling this stuff out of my ass because I think it sounds cool, or I want to be relevant, or want to turn Jesus into an activist or whatever, as some people have accused me of. But rather, I'm a part of a different tradition, a stream within Christianity that has always existed, of those who use their faith to be empowered to fight for justice. And this has existed within churches and more over the last couple centuries, and the academy, and also in the streets, just among people talking. And so being inspired by this other version of Christian, this other stream, this other tradition, I wrote this book pulling from a lot of those resources. And so this book is based on the idea of Jesus flipping tables in the temple the week he's killed, which is one of multiple political demonstrations he does that week. And yeah, pretty much bringing or highlighting that activist part of Jesus and the injustice of the Roman Empire that he was speaking out against, and the ways that he had seen his own religion compromised and corrupted within the context of the Roman Empire. And so I try to show, like, look at Jesus's radical faith, who was able to reclaim the radical heart of his faith, first century Judaism, and use that radical prophetic heart of his faith to speak out against the ways that he had seen people of his own faith give into injustice. And so I try to say, like, so people who consider themselves followers of this dude, it makes sense if you also look around and feel like, yeah, this whole Christian thing seems to have lost that radical and prophetic heart. And so when we speak out against that, we're pretty aligned with Jesus. It's not just about just submissive obedience. It's about being able to stand up for what's right, and that includes putting yourself out there to speak out against injustice and do something about it to the extent that it could get you killed, which is what happens on the cross. Okay? Let's not over-spiritualize this, people. Let's realize Jesus was a marginalized person under the oppression of an empire, put on a cross, which was a political execution designed specifically for the crime of sedition, for the crime of rebellion, for trying to criticize or do something that could potentially be seen as a threat to the rule of Rome. And so he's put on a cross on a hill, tortured for everyone to see for hours and hours and hours toward the entrance of the city, so that everyone can see. Like, that's the important part of it. So that everyone could be deterred from standing up to Rome. Many, many people were crucified. Hundreds of thousands, if not maybe millions, but definitely at least hundreds of thousands of people crucified. And it was often group crucifixions of just like long lines of people on crosses. Like they say Jesus was crucified between two other dudes. But honestly, I think historically speaking, because we got to remember, the gospel writers aren't historians, they're evangelists. So they're summarizing the story in very particular ways in order to send a message to people about the type of person Jesus was. But personally, I think there probably were a bunch more people than just two other dudes. And I also think this was probably just a normal day for the Roman soldiers that crucified him. They're just like, another one. Put them up there. Do what we do. It's a process we do all the time. And the difference with the followers of Jesus, because anyone who claimed to be the Messiah was put on a cross. Because if you're claiming to be ushering in the kingdom of God, you're implying the ushering out of the kingdom of Caesar. And so the difference with this guy who claimed to be the Messiah is that his followers went back home and decided, I think we were wrong about what the Messiah is, not necessarily who the Messiah is. And they realize we're called to be the body of the Messiah, the body of Christ. Now we'll get to that. Let me cut myself off here, because now we're getting into resurrection territory, because you got to ask, well, what made them change their mind? We'll get to that in the bonus episode and when we talk about Easter, but I'm trying to give you a picture of the context of people being put on crosses before we get into this. But in this book, I go through, it isn't all just about Jesus in that week where he was crucified. It's a lot about the way this radical stream throughout history of people who use their faith to empower them to fight for justice. And so talk about colonization and decolonization, talk about prison abolition, police abolition, reparations, talk about liberation theology, and a bunch of different stuff. But then at the end of the book, I get into the last 2 chapters about that last week in Jesus's life. And second to last chapter is called A Riot at the Temple. The last chapter, Jesus, the outside agitator. And this is all leading me up to say what I was going to say earlier when I was saying there's so many angles we had approached this from. I decided for this episode to just read the end of the book. The very end. It's only the very end that I talk about Jesus on the cross. And then I'll pause throughout and just riff on it. And so let's just get right into it. First of all, Jesus. I talk a bit about, it's called Jesus the Outside Agitator because as I talk about this week of political demonstrations before Jesus is arrested and executed, I go back and forth between talking about that and the modern context of today's protests, specifically the Black Lives Matter protests we were seeing and the discourse around it of, well, is it right? Is it justified when it turns into a riot or when property is damaged or when businesses are looted? There's a lot of argument over, do they really understand what this protest is about? And there was argument of what are the solutions we're actually seeking? Are we just seeking for Derek Chauvin to be arrested? Are we seeking for some police reform? Or are we seeking for police a little defunding, or are we seeking for police abolition? Like, what are we really seeking here? And so I think some people during that time felt like the most tame version of it all was just like, basically would boil down to just a slap on the wrist on the police department, would be like they felt like they were the real ones who really knew what the protest was about. Meanwhile, you had people who had been protesting police violence for decades who were like, no, this actually isn't just about George Floyd. And this also just isn't about the Minneapolis Police Department. This also isn't just about the police. This is about changing the world. And specifically, transforming a system that marginalizes Black people in ways that has continued since chattel slavery. And so, my friends, through that lens, I then go through the story of Jesus being arrested, or protesting and being arrested. And, the outside agitator part. Some people would criticize some of these protests and say that people who try to escalate the protests were just outside agitators, agent provocateurs, just people who were coming in as basically like trolls who are just trying to disrupt the protest to get it stopped or to just rile people up. That's the worst criticism, that like it's outside agitators making people angry about police violence. Not at all. And that also is a very old criticism that was even being used during the slavery abolition era, that people would be saying, oh, these people who are enslaved are trying to fight back against their slave holders, because there must be some outside agitators, some white liberals who are coming in and putting all these radical ideas in their head that slavery is wrong. It's like, no. They know it's wrong because they're experiencing it. And so that outside agitator criticism goes back all the way back then and continues to this day. But I also use that to say, like, I believe people would have seen Jesus as an outside agitator as well. I mean, first of all, he's from Galilee and a small town, a small poor town, Nazareth, within Galilee, and which also like has a bit of a revolutionary past. A couple decades before Jesus was born, there was another messianic claimant named Judas the Galilean, who led a pretty big violent revolt of Jews against the Roman Empire, and he was crushed. And that memory would have been fresh, not just within people's minds, but within the culture of Galilee, and especially experiencing the suppression that followed the crushing of that revolt. And so Jesus, this radical guy from this little town in Nazareth, coming all the way to Jerusalem and flipping tables, pouring out coins, talking about the ushering in the kingdom of God, talking about the end of the Roman Empire, which is really what he's referring to when he's talking about the end of the world. He's talking about like the end of this reign, the end of this status quo, the way we do things, and the end to all this war and violence. And so he would have been seen as someone who's just this random radical guy who's just trying to stir people up with dangerous ideas. But he's like speaking for so many of the people who experience this oppression and have a deeper understanding of it, especially compared to some of the religious leaders who had some distance from some of that oppression because their position within the temple would have allowed them a little bit more privileges than Jesus and the type of people that Jesus gathered. And so within that, let's start reading here. When I talk a bit about Jesus getting arrested, I said, yeah, Jesus's critics would have easily labeled him an outside agitator as well. Coming from a poor town in Galilee, Jesus riots in the temple, causing trouble and stirring up others. His arrest and execution were inevitable. Protesting oppressive institutions in a way that has an impact will always have deadly consequences. It's kind of wild. I haven't read this in a long time, but I stand behind this book. Go buy this book, people. Even though I'm spoiling it and reading at the very end, I promise you there's so much more in this book. And I appreciate everybody who has read this book. Of course. Anyway, let's continue. This is the risk taken by all who participate in this process. Fighting for this new world is the most honorable cause in the eyes of those in the new world, and the most dishonorable cause in the eyes of those in the current world. Those who fight to preserve this world as it is are idolized. Those who fight for a new world are vilified. By the way, if you like my voice, you like hearing me just read things, there's also an audiobook. Go check out the audiobook on Audible right now. Okay, cool. I gotta make sure to plug, people. Stick with me. Also, like I said, I stand behind this book, and I love it, and I loved writing it, and I think everything I put in here I think is really important, and so I want more people to read it. Or request it at your library. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. That's enough plugging. I just wanted to make sure I cover my bases. Let's continue. Many will condemn a protest as illegitimate when protesters break the law or resist arrest. But it is nonsensical to require those protesting the unjust law to follow the unjust law they are protesting. The law is a representation of the state's monopoly on violence. The law permits state forces to enact violence by any means necessary to protect the law, so their actions are not popularly perceived as violent since they are not technically breaking the law. All forms of counterviolence, even counterviolence through property damage, are popularly perceived as wrong because of the law that was designed to suppress their resistance. Let's pause here. I mean, a little bit before this, I was talking about how like we see Jesus as like this innocent man who was unjustly arrested and executed. But that innocence isn't because he didn't break the law. He did. Like we say, who's crucified as a criminal. Like there's hymns, prayers, creeds, songs, poems that refer to Jesus as crucified as a criminal, like unjustly crucified as a criminal. Like even the way some people say it is like, oh man, they had Jesus so messed up, they saw him as a criminal. Well, yeah, he was. Straight up. That's why they put him on the cross. And let's keep going. Of course, there will always be parts of different protests that we condemn. Because, oh yeah, here's me covering my bases for the critics who are getting a little scared at this part. There was a lot of those voices in my head of like, oh, if I write this, then so and so will be like, well, what about this, or just easily misinterpret me. So I had to put in little things like this. But really, one of the big lessons I learned in writing the book was to just tell those voices to shut up and just write for the people I'm trying to write for. But yeah, it just reminded me of that. No, remembering writing this part for the people who like would say like, oh, so you say you don't condemn anything ever at all, part of any protest? No. Let's keep going. Of course, there will always be parts of different protests that we condemn because we do not always act in our best interest. However, the actions of protesters that we condemn should be observed through the lens of harm, not through the lens of crime. Determining harm and determining whether some harm is ever morally justifiable should be discussed, but that determination should not be made through the lens of crime, since the interpretation of crime depends on who holds the monopoly on violence. Condemning protests through the lens of crime obscures the harm that people are protesting, perpetuating the lie that protesters who break the law are just as bad as those they're protesting against. Jesus broke the law, but we proclaim him innocent because he did not cause harm. Let's keep that same energy with everyone else. Dang, this is some good writing. Yeah, there's some parts of this book that I could look back on and wish I would have had more time to make it flow better or more clear, but I like this part. This is good. This is good stuff. Buy my book, people. Okay, next part. A little heading called Pick Up Your Cross. And it says, it's clear Jesus knew he would be arrested and executed as he and his disciples snuck back and forth through the Mount of Olives to stay in Bethany at night. I talk a lot about this, by the way, in last week's episode. So go check that out if you haven't. It's like all about Jesus's arrest and some of the first political demonstrations he did during that week. So go check that out, people. Let's keep going. Jesus was finally arrested and the Mount of Olives when his disciples, who were supposed to keep watch while he prayed, fell asleep. Jesus knew his resistance would lead to his execution, and his disciples knew they were risking their own lives as well. A common saying of the Christian life since the early church is, pick up your cross and follow me. This saying has been interpreted alongside other New Testament passages that speak about rejoicing in suffering. Unfortunately, many have interpreted this idea as a command for passivity in the face of oppression. Oppressors teach the oppressed to, quote, rejoice in suffering and passively accept their abuse with gratitude. However, the New Testament's idea of rejoicing in suffering had nothing to do with passivity. Firstly, the suffering being referred to is the violent suppression from the powerful when you commit to a life of liberation. The Apostle Paul tells Christians to rejoice in their suffering because of the larger process of justice that is enacted in the world through those who are willing to struggle for the cause of liberation. A life of passivity would be one that avoids resistance and is safe from potential suppression. Taking up your cross and rejoicing in suffering is about accepting that you will suffer more than others because you choose a life of resistance to injustice and not a life of passivity that may warrant less suffering. Okay, let's stop there real quick. Because I also wanted to make sure I talked about in this episode the crucified people of today, which and that term, the crucified people, comes from the liberation theologian Ignacio Ellaceria. Good stuff, by the way, really good stuff. And he talks about first off, viewing the historical crucifixion of Jesus through this lens of his political context and realizing that coming from an oppressed people and crucifixion in general was one of the ways that continued to oppress people. And Jesus experiences that, and not as some sort of passive, obedient submission, but as a part of his active resistance to the evils of the Roman Empire. And when you live that kind of radical life, it leads you toward suppression that could even result in unjust arrest and execution. And so he talks about today the oppressed people of the world who continue to experience the kind of oppression that Jesus was experiencing through the process of crucifixion. And talk about how when we talk about salvation, or maybe a better way to put it, liberation, happening through the death of Jesus, there is a similar type of historical salvation and liberation happening today through the oppression and death of today's crucified peoples, today's oppressed people. And that isn't to say that they need to die. Also isn't to say that Jesus needed to die. But it's to say, in the long historical process of liberation, there are people who will live a life of resistance, and even so many people whose mere existence is resistance, who will experience this kind of suppression. And yet, we have to choose the side of the oppressed and join in this fight so that people can stop being oppressed and stop being crucified. This is the life that Jesus calls us to, which is what he's referring to when he says, pick up your own cross. Okay? You get it, people? Let's keep going. Oh yeah, wait. The other thing I wanted to say for crucified people. Today, we're seeing this. And I think one of the contexts we're seeing this in is mass deportations happening under Trump in the United States, and the continual more funding and more access and freedom that they're giving to ICE so that they can carry out these mass deportations, and expanding who they're able to arrest and deport. And they've expanded it to legal immigrants who are here legally, went through all the process legally that they say, like, all you have to do is just do it legally, people. It's not that hard. People who did it legally and who have visas or green cards who are still being arrested by, first of all, being spied on, which is already unjust. Secondly, harassed. Thirdly, arrested. Fourthly, sent to these detention camps with no due process, no judicial process, because ICE is able to act outside of the judicial process, which is part of the power that was given to them in the Bush era, because ICE was created as a counter-terrorist department under the Department of Homeland Security. And so no process. And also sent to these camps to be not just sent back home, but to be imprisoned there and tortured there, and some even killed there. And all as a way, apparently, to be a deterrent to immigration. You're starting to see some of the similarities here. And if you want to hear me talk more about this issue in particular, I did a whole YouTube video on my main channel, Damon Garcia, recently. It's called something about churches should be the first to protect immigrants. I think it's called that. You can find it. But yeah, go way in depth on this stuff. And I'm really, really proud of that video. I think y'all will really like it. But I think of that today And oh yeah, and it's expanded also to people who are just protesting the genocide in Israel. Even people who aren't even using the word genocide, but like people with student visas, who are immigrants with student visas, did it all legally, and some even with green cards, who happen to be a part of these pro-Palestine protests, are now also being arrested and getting their visa status taken away. And even like not even part of the protest. Like there's a woman from Turkey who helped write a school newspaper article criticizing the actions of the Israeli government and standing with Palestinian people. And they arrested her, and she's gone now with no judicial process at all. And they're calling her pro-Hamas. That's the argument, is that they're terrorist supporters, terrorist sympathizers. And it's awful to see and really scary to see the ways that the surveillance state, the police state, and state violence is being expanded more and more. And again, it makes me think of Jesus. And that these are the people that Jesus not only would stand in solidarity with, but these are the people that Jesus was. This is the group that Jesus was part of. I mean, even at the beginning of his life, his family had to flee from Nazareth, and they lived in Egypt for a while to escape persecution of Herod. Jesus was literally a refugee. But we shouldn't even need to say that. and also, Jesus is unjustly persecuted for participating in a protest that the government saw as a threat. And he's executed for it. And so, let's keep going. This headline called "Father, Forgive Them" says, in Luke 23, Jesus says on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This is the only instance in Jesus' ministry where he forgives someone who isn't in a marginalized position in society. And he gives it to the soldiers who kill him. Now, I did a whole chapter on forgiveness and very different understanding of forgiveness than I know a lot of you, or maybe even all of you, have ever heard. And really understanding it is like when Jesus offers the forgiveness of sins to people. Because, I mean, within the context of he'll heal people, and to some of them he'll say, your sins are forgiven. First off, understanding sin as a primarily systemic issue, which we talked all about in that episode, It's Systemic. So if you want to go more in depth on that, go check that out. And secondly, when he's offering forgiveness, which is a kind of freeing of debts, freeing of oppression, freeing of suppression, I think it's important to flip our typical understanding of it and see Jesus as freeing them from the pressure of the sins done to them. Which is why he's offering forgiveness to those who had the most sin done to them. When Jesus is offering the forgiveness of sins, he's not going to those who are guilty of the most sin, rather to those who have had the most sin done to them. And by forgiving them of their sin, in other words, by relieving them of the pressure of the systemic sin that they have to bear from the world, Jesus is freeing them to stop blaming themselves for it. Like those in power want to put all the blame for systemic sin on marginalized people, on those who suffer from it the most. And Jesus is offering a new path to start to see the world differently and start to do something about this. And so it's a whole chapter. Eventually, I want to write way more on that concept that I talked about in that chapter. But that'll be a much later project. So, yeah, that's what I'm referring to in this part of the book when I say, like, who Jesus forgave. And so I said, let's continue. Jesus always forgives those who are the most dehumanized by society. And before he dies, he forgives these soldiers who are also dehumanized, albeit in a much different way. Dehumanized by the Roman power structure, these soldiers. And then I say, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire explains how oppressors gradually dehumanize themselves the longer they dehumanize others. The oppressed must struggle for their own freedom and dignity as they restore their freedom, as they restore their humanity by abolishing the systems that sustain their oppression. However, another important part of this process is the oppressed restoring the humanity of their oppressors too, by taking away oppressors' power to dominate and oppress and suppress. Freire argues it is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. Taking away the ability to oppress from those in positions of oppressive power is difficult because to the oppressor, taking away their power feels like a form of oppression. They won't have the ability to understand how oppressive their role is in society until their ability to oppress is taken away. Just as Jesus said, they do not know what they're doing. Because by dehumanizing others, they have dehumanized themselves to the extent that they can't comprehend the impact of their actions. We can never expect our oppression to end by the hand of those in positions of power. We cannot persuade them to see the error of their ways. The only way they can understand the impact of their actions is through the oppressed taking away their power. Authentic transformation can only come from below, not above. Only those who experience the constraints of the current world can figure out how to build a better world and then build it. Those who significantly benefit from the power and privilege they hold in the current world cannot lead the transformation our world desperately needs because, again, they do not know what they are doing. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Again, bro's spitting. And who wrote this? This is good stuff. Yeah, this is the type of stuff. Like when I'm talking about Jesus's last week and protests and arrests and execution from this very different lens that some of you may not be used to, or this very radical lens. Part of why I put it at the end, because the original plan was for some of this part to be toward the beginning of the book, but I just felt like I needed to explain this whole other different framework of faith and politics, which I do throughout this whole book, before I retell this story of Jesus's execution through this different lens. Like if I just started out with this, like I think it would seem kind of confusing and feel like, is Damon just making this stuff up? Like what is he talking about? But after you read through this whole thing of me giving y'all this different framework, it makes a lot more sense. Because it's like, I give you this framework, give you this lens, and then we use that lens to then look at this story. And it all makes sense. And so, yeah, I'm proud of this book, people. This is a good book. Where are we at? Oh, yeah, let's keep going. Jesus commands his followers to love their enemies. We can only love every human on the planet. Oh, wait, so let me say that again. Jesus commands his followers to love their enemies. We can love every human on the planet and still have enemies because our society is still structured in a way that gives some people unjust power over others. Yes. By the way, y'all should also read this other book called How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. I just looked it up right now, by Melissa Flora Bixler, which pretty much like goes very in depth on what I just said right there. That like, yeah, we could love everybody, but still have enemies because someone is your enemy because they're working against you. And so when Jesus says love our enemies, he's not saying like, well, if you love everybody, then you won't have enemies. Like, no, you still have enemies because of how they treat you or how they're working against you. And then I say the best way to love our enemies is by removing them from oppressive positions and restoring their humanity through that process. And so that book goes way, 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 way more in depth on that idea, which I think is really, really good and helpful, especially within that conversation of loving your enemies, but then also talking about systemic injustice and how we change the world and how we transform some of those situations of oppression. So let's continue. Let's see here. Oh, this is the last little section heading follow me. We're at the end. Spoiler alert, everybody. Or maybe it's like, if you haven't read this book, you could see it like those cool movies where it shows the beginning, or it shows the ending first, and then you go back to the beginning and see how it all unfolded. That's what this is, people. We're being artsy, okay? Follow me. Okay, it says, this work of liberation includes all of us, but it is led from below, not from above. It is first named by those who experience the constraints of the current world, and the new world is developed as a solution to the problems they name. Even if we do not see the new world we desire in our lifetime, we still get the honorable opportunity to commit our short lives to this long and difficult work of liberation. The only way we can relate to each other in healthier ways is by transforming our material conditions so that we may open up space to relate to each other in ways we couldn't have before. Religion has been used to suppress these efforts by justifying our social divisions, but religion can also be used to empower our resistance to our social divisions. This is the tension we live with. Awareness of this tension can help us intentionally choose the form of faith that truly frees us. That's the kind of religion I'm interested in. That's the kind of Jesus I'm interested in. That's the kind of God I'm interested in. That's the kind of life I'm interested in. A life lived to the fullest is a life committed to our collective liberation. That idea drove Jesus to the cross. We can debate endlessly about what happened metaphysically when Jesus died on the cross and what it means on a cosmic level that Jesus died for us. But we can say with absolute certainty that Jesus also died in the way most revolutionaries do. Jesus died for a cause. He wouldn't have gathered followers before his death if his death was solely for the purpose of making a metaphysical transaction in an otherworldly spiritual realm. He died for us, all of us, right here, right now. And we are called to respond by picking up our own crosses. And we do that by stirring up the same kind of trouble. Dang. And then there's a little conclusion that talks about something else, which I'm not going to spoil. You got to go read the book from beginning to end to get the conclusion. Also the acknowledgments and the notes. What else is in here? A couple blank pages at the end. You get it. And dang, this is a good this is a good book, people. You know, the reason I keep coming back on that is because I'm writing another book right now that I actually think is better than this book. It's about something very different, sort of, but I feel like my writing has improved a lot, and I'm noticing that as I'm writing this book, which is cool. But it kind of made me forget, like, no, there's parts in this, though, that really hit. So, good job. Good job, Damon Garcia from the past. But yeah, let me look at this end thing. So, Jesus died. Jesus died for us. Jesus died for a cause. And there's all these theories, theological theories, they call them atonement theories, of what happened on a cosmic level when Jesus died on the cross. That's what I was like very subtly referring to there. Like, was it that the world belonged to the devil, and then when Jesus died, he was taking the world back from the devil? That was an early theory. Or was it like Jesus was taking on the guilt of the sin of the world that was on humanity, but then God put it on Jesus instead so that humanity wouldn't be guilty? Or did he do that but only for like a small amount of people? Or was Jesus like showing people this radical love for that God had for the world through the crucifixion? But the earliest theory that we see talked about in the Bible, and we see just through the actions of the early church, was Jesus dying as a radical example of living this kind of radical life, which is what I referred to there. And there are other ways to interpret it, of course. I don't think this is the only way to interpret it. But I think it's important to show that this is like the primary immediate interpretation that empowers people to continue the work of Jesus in those first few years. And so why does that matter? Because I feel like a lot of people today grow up with versions of Christianity, and they're going to go to church today and on Easter and get taught a certain version of this story that's just so individualized and so overly spiritualized that they just make it about like, hey, Jesus died for you and now you could just chill, or you could just try to be like on your best behavior and read the Bible and go to church all the time and worship Jesus and try to be a good guy every now and then. But it's rare that people at a Good Friday or Easter service will talk about how Jesus calls us to a life of radical resistance against the injustices of empire to the extent that it could get you killed. And yet that's how Jesus' first followers interpreted that execution and that life. And especially because Jesus is the whole ministry, his whole ministry, he's teaching his disciples to do what he does, to teach like he teaches, to heal people like he does, to gather community like he does, to serve people like he does. And then it's so interesting in the Gospel of John, in that version, John, the disciple, and Jesus' mother Mary are at the cross. And he says to them, John, this is your mother. And to his mom, this is your son. And I see that as like Jesus, as he's dying, is telling them, what I was to you, now you go be to each other. Like you go embody what I've been doing. You continue this through your own lives. You're the body of Christ now. Which I think is the most important message of Christianity. All these sermons given, all this theology talked about, I think it all just comes down to we're called to be the body of God in the world. The incarnation continues through us. That's it. And I think that's the unique message of Christianity when you compare it to other religions. And I mean, people talk about like all these different similarities on different religious messages, but I think that's the unique gift that Christianity brings to important interfaith conversations. And what's funny, I ended with this. That's the end of the book. Like I said, the conclusion is about something else. It doesn't talk about the crucifixion or whatever. But it ends with Jesus on the cross, dying, and saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. His disciples remembering, he said, follow me, pick up your own cross. And I'm like, yeah, he died for us. All right here, right now. We're called to respond by picking up our own crosses. We do that by stirring up the same kind of trouble. And then it just ends. And when I wrote that, I kind of felt like, isn't that a little, I don't know about, this feels right. But what if people feel like I'm making some sort of statement about the resurrection by ending there? Like, is Damon just saying, like, Jesus just died and that's it? Is that what he's trying to say? Or did he just, like, forget to add the part where Jesus comes back from the dead? Or is Damon trying to make a statement that Jesus definitely didn't come back from the dead? Or is he just like trying to communicate something to a specific audience, and is that why he's writing that? Or is that just a cliffhanger for the sequel? I don't like the end. Oh, no, never mind. I was going to say like the end of the Passion of the Christ, but he came back at the end, the very, very end. And I felt like it would be controversial. But here's the other thing. I was partly inspired by the Gospel of Mark, which ends differently than Matthew, Luke, and John. And Jesus is crucified on the cross. The group of women go to the tomb that Jesus was put in, and they see that it's empty. And a man in a white robe is sitting there and tells them, Jesus isn't here. Why, what you looking for? He's risen. Go tell the disciples. And then it says the woman ran away and said nothing to no one, didn't say anything to anyone because they were too afraid. And then it just ends. That's it. And then hundreds of years later, a group of monks with the knowledge of how Matthew, Luke, and John added these narratives of Jesus coming back and talking to people and hanging out and ascending. With that knowledge, a group of monks were like, this is an awkward ending to Mark. Let's just fill it out, inspired by those other endings, and write our own version here of Jesus coming back. But I find it fascinating that the original Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel written around the year 70, just ends like that. Jesus isn't here. And then they ran away and didn't say anything to anyone because they were too scared. And that's it. But I think there's something so fascinating about that because it ends like so many of Jesus's parables. And even some of the stories that people write about Jesus in those Gospels. A lot of these parables end with a question and a cliffhanger. Like the most popular parable is the parable of the prodigal son. Son asks his dad for an early inheritance, and he goes and blows it all, feels really bad, comes back. His father accepts him and is so happy that he's back and throws a party. But we don't really know how the son responds to that. And then it cuts to the other son who stayed all along, is upset that his father, it's like this son betrayed us. And he dishonored you, Dad. And yet you're welcoming him like nothing, and you're throwing this big party, but you've never thrown a party for me. And then the dad is like, everything I have has always been yours. Your brother was lost and found, and should I not throw a party like this? And then it just ends. We don't get the reaction of the son, of either of the sons. And it's left there like that on purpose, because when you tell this story, that people listening are supposed to be like, what happens next, so that they can discuss the message of the story with each other. Well, what would you do? How would you respond to that situation? How would you have lived it differently? What would you do if that happened to you? What does this mean? What does this mean for the way we live our lives? It's supposed to end like that, to stir discussion. And so I believe that is what Mark is going for by ending it like that. He isn't here. He's risen. Go tell people. I don't know. Let me go run away afraid. I don't know if I want to tell anyone anything. And then it just stops and it's like, now what do you do? Now what would you do? Inspired by that, I ended the book like this. Yeah, he died, and we're all called to respond by picking up our own cross, and we do that by stirring up the same kind of trouble. And it just ends. And it's like, what do you do now? And you're also, I also like it because I imagine it's like, it's putting you in the same position that these disciples were put in during those days after the crucifixion of like, what do we do now? We thought this was our guy. We thought it was going to play out differently. And then he got executed. What do we do now? And when I was promoting this book, I had a little launch live stream with Trip Fuller of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. And we're talking about this. And he said earlier that day, somebody was asking him what he was up to. And he said he was reading this book, The God Who Riots, and how he's going to talk to me about it. And they asked, oh, what's that book about? And Tripp thought about it, and he said, it's about practicing the resurrection. Or being the resurrection, something like that. And when he said that, that made me so happy. I think there's a video of it. Yeah, like the full live stream is on my YouTube channel. You can go back and check it out. But I think there may be a clip of it too up there. But that part, I mean, but I was so happy because I felt like, yes, that first of all is really what this book is about. And second of all, that's why I ended it like that, with this cliffhanger of Jesus on the cross. Because we're called to respond by living out the resurrection, by being the risen body of Christ in the world, continuing this work of liberation and resistance, this radical life lived to the fullest. So what do you do? What would you do? That's the question to be asked on this Good Friday. How do you live your life? And we'll leave that with that cliffhanger. If you want to hear me keep talking about this and give some hot takes, even hotter takes on resurrection and Easter, then go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia. And I'll see you over there in a couple of days. Thanks for watching. Happy Good Friday, everybody. Peace out.